Hey guys, this is my last episode in the series we've been doing on Parallax. I'm going to go through one quick example on how we can trigger events on elements based on their position within the viewport. And then we're also going to go through some examples of how we can expand on the things we've learned to create other interesting effects. So let's dive in. So we're going to start with this really tall document that has a single white square in the middle of it. And this is so we can see how it responds based on scrolling inside and outside the viewport. And our goal here is to trigger events that are actually going to change properties of the square based on its relative position to the viewport. So whether it's inside the viewport, outside the viewport, or on the edge. So as you can see, the markup here is relatively simple. We just have our square set to 100 by 100 pixels based on its ID in CSS. But what we also have going on is we are also styling it based on this data attribute called data in view. And so when this isn't set, it's styling it to white. What we're going to do is we're going to update this value and have that manipulate the colors in CSS. So first we're going to create an animation loop with request animation frame. Then each time that fires, we're going to subsequently call request animation frame again, calling the same method. Then we're going to create a method called update in view. And this is where we're going to update these properties based on our element's position. So inside this update in view method, we're going to create this variable that's going to store all of our elements with that data in view attribute. So we're going to call query selector all with data in view. Then we're going to loop over all of those elements and collect some values. So we're going to get the element's bounding client rectangle, store that as a variable, and then we're going to get the previous value of that in-view data attribute. Then we're going to create a new value variable. Next, we're going to check the rectangle's values against some values of the viewport. So first, we're going to check the rectangle top and see if it's greater than the window's inner height, or if the rectangle bottom is less than 0, because this means that it's outside of the viewport altogether. So then we set our new value to 0. Next, we check if the rectangle's top is less than the window's inner height divided by 2 minus the rectangle's height divided by 2. And if the rectangle's top is greater than 0. This means that our square is in the viewport but above half of the window, so in the upper half of our viewport. And then we set the new value to 3. So next we check if the rectangle's bottom is less than the window's inner height and the rectangle's top is greater than 0. And this just means that it's completely inside of the viewport, and if it passed that previous if-else statement, then that means it's below half of the viewport. So then we set our new value to 2. Then if all of these if-else statements fail, we're going to set new value to 1. And it's going to hit this when it's on either the top border overlapping the edge of the viewport or the bottom border overlapping the edge of the viewport. Next, we're going to check the new value against the previous value, and if they're different, then we're going to update the data attribute in view on our element. Next, we're going to create the CSS styles for all of those data attribute values, and we're going to make it so that when it's in the top half of the viewport, it's green. When it's in the lower half, it's yellow. And then when it's on the border of the top or bottom, it's going to be orange. And then when it's outside, it's going to be red. So now if we preview this, you can see it's yellow when it's in the lower half of our viewport. When it's at the center or above, it's green. And then when it's on the top edge overlapping the edge, or the top or the bottom overlapping the bottom edge, it turns orange. Now you can't see it when it turns red because it's outside of the viewport. So in order for us to track if it's outside the viewport, we want to have other elements in the document be able to respond to this. So what we're going to do is trigger an event on our element. So we'll create this custom in-view event variable. Then we're going to make that a custom event called inView, which takes a second parameter of an object that has a detail property where you can pass other information. We're going to pass our new value. then we're simply going to dispatch this event on our element. So now we need a way to respond to these events. So we're going to create a new method called add_in_view_listener, where we're going to iterate over all our data in view elements again. So using the same query selector all accessing data in view, we're going to loop over all of these elements, and then we're going to add an event listener for that in view event. Then we simply create a event handler, and we switch through the event object that's passed in detail property. And so here we'll create a catch statement for each of these values that we're going to look for. So if we look back at our HTML, we have an element that's kind of fixed in the corner of our document that you can't see because there's nothing in it right now, but it's called trigger status. So what we want to do is update the content of this to tell us what the state of our element is. So now I'm going to update those all real quick just so they tell us both what that data in view value is, but also what the element's relationship is to the viewport. So now when we test this, you can see that it clearly reflects the values and updates that based on our event that's triggering on the element. And we even can see that it's outside the viewport when our element is no longer visible. So one other thing to consider is that right now our update in view method is firing at every request animation frame loop, no matter what happens, so it's constantly being triggered. One thing we can do to make sure that that only happens on scroll is add an event listener to the window that fires on scroll, and then create a scrolled variable that's initially set to false. Then we simply set that to true when the window scrolls, and in our update loop, we check that to see if the window is scrolled and then fire update in view. Then we set it back to false. So this way it'll only fire when there's a scroll and when this needs updating on the request animation frame loop. So we've talked about a lot of different things that you can do with parallax and scroll-based effects in websites. And there's way more, and you can actually take a lot of these things we've talked about and apply them to different types of elements and content in HTML in different ways to create new effects. So I just want to talk about a few other things that we didn't really cover, but you could kind of use to expand on how you use these effects based on scrolling in websites. So you can always take the scroll value and apply it to content like video so that it scrubs through video content as you move through a document. This has been used by Apple a lot of times, which I think creates some really cool effects. We can also scroll SVG content, so you can actually draw in SVG content based on the scroll position. And GreenSock has a great Draw SVG plugin that allows you to do this really easily. It's also important to realize that we can leverage other kinds of content like Canvas and WebGL. So here you can see we can actually use the scroll position to update the camera's Y position in our WebGL scene, creating really interesting background effects that are 3D and simply update based on our scroll position. So here we're really leveraging the animation value of Parallax. So that's it for my series on Parallax. I hope you guys have enjoyed it, and if you want to see more stuff like this, be sure to subscribe. Thanks.